What I'm going to talk about is not all science jobs being the same, and the 10 types of scientists is our way of broadening the way people look at where they can go in their future with a science qualification. But just a little bit about the Science Council. We're very proud to have a Royal Charter. We have one of these big documents with a big red seal on it in our office, which is relatively rare. But there was a smaller sort of friendship organisation of professional bodies pre-2003 of about 9 organisations. We now have 41 professional bodies who in turn embrace nearly 500,000 individual scientists working across the economy and society. 3 main aims: to serve society and the economy by enhancing the professionalism of the science workforce. And I come from a background where I've worked for a long time in public trust in science, and I realised a long time ago, when I've been talking about everything from use of animals in medical research, embryo research, cruise missiles, that it wasn't so much the public trust of the science, but the public trust of the scientists who did it that was an issue. So that's very much a strand of our work. We provide a policy voice. One of the issues for the UK government is that they face a lot of noise. The science community is very good at speaking up for itself, but sometimes there's a lot of noise going on and they can't really distinguish what the key points are. So our job is to try and pull that together. And we support member bodies to be more effective, and I'll explain some of the things that our workforce work has led us to do, particularly in the field of diversity. And then the sort of other part of what we do is professional registration across the science workforce. We started with chartered scientists, and part of our Royal Charter meant that we were the first of the technical chartered organisations in the UK to introduce mandatory monitored CPD to maintain your charter status. And I was recruited to introduce that, and everybody said we had 5 years to do it, so 2009 would be a bad year. What I can tell you is that 2009, 2010, 2011 were very difficult years for introducing CPD, where a lot of scientists, and I think you probably as younger scientists will relate to this, thought that all they had to do was prove they were clever, not that they were also competent. We've now moved to registered scientist, which is level 4, so graduate and above largely, with 2 years experience in the workplace, and then technician, registered science technician, which is actually where the biggest shortage lies in staffing. You're not expected to read this, but it just gives a fun idea of how many different organisations are in the Science Council. So I bet you none of you were aware there was an organisation for professionals in regulatory affairs, TOPRA, and I will come into on my 10 types of scientists to explain why this proliferation of professional bodies is occurring and how different they are. But there's everything here from the disciplines of physics, maths, biology and chemistry to sports and exercise science, which might be using all of those. One of the things we started with, I came to the Science Council and I said, right, who can join us? I want to expand. And they said, well, anybody who's working in science. So what's science? I said. And they said, oh, well, everybody knows what science is. But actually, 18 months later, we came up with a definition. It really did take all that time. And one of our tests through this was whether homeopathy would slip in under the radar. I know you're probably all aware that our voluntary registers system in the UK has decided it's going to register homeopathists. And there's a very good letter in the Times today that says the public will be able to tell the difference between a charlatan and a registered charlatan. However, the pursuit of science, so this, I'm not going to read it through, but we put this up as a draft because the Science Council was quite convinced that the sky would fall in if we got it wrong. And actually we have had some amazing comments from the general public about this. It's started to get a bit more traction and in use, and there's currently quite a big debate going on in the psychology world where there's those who are using our definition and those who aren't. But I think the science community tends to make assumptions about a lot of things and don't actually go out to the general public and explain what they're about. And so this was a way of doing that. So why are we focused on skills? Well, the impact the Science Council wants to have is an efficient UK science-based economy. So we need sufficient people with the right skills to drive forward the knowledge and the application of that knowledge. And it isn't just about making money. This is actually also in public services. To do that, we needed to understand the current and future workforce, and we're on the second round of some quite detailed and fairly innovative research on the way we look at that, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. We have an ambition for the workforce to reflect diversity. I mean, one of the biggest issues, for example, in engineering is they're very short of people, but they appear to only be recruiting from 50% of the population. So that needs to change. And there are some areas of science where it's over 90% male. So we need to adjust some of these things. Labour market information, particularly for young people. I'm a governor of a further education college on the south coast, and this isn't an example from science, but it is a good example. I met a young boy who had worked very hard to get onto a course that was to give him the first year's training for him to join what we called the uniformed public services. So in readiness of going into the fire service, ambulance service, police, and those sorts of things. And he'd set his heart on being a fireman, and he finished that course just as we cut a third of our fire brigade. That we need to help young people make those choices and connect up that information. We need to help their parents understand what the future looks like, so that you don't get a lot of people doing courses that really don't help. And half of all of our STEM graduates in the UK, so we have 195,000 a year, half of those don't go into a STEM occupation. And we need to understand whether they do that knowingly or whether it's because there's a mismatch with what they chose to learn and where it would take them. We also need to understand what trends are coming from employers. So one of the issues that you will see in the newspapers all the time is employers can't get enough graduates or STEM graduates. Good news in the Irish papers this morning, because I gather your graduate recruitment trends are up, but understanding why that's happening is really important. And it has something to do with the large number of graduates, and again I'm going to explain it. And then for science, the skills gaps are just as important as the skills shortages. So you might have graduated 30 years ago, but you're still practicing somewhere. How do you stay up to date? The science is changing very fast. But what's on offer from the university system is, you know, finish your, given your notice at your work, go and sign up for a 2-year master's degree, which you've got to fund yourself, and then go and look for another job. Aligning the keeping up to date and the continuing education and CPD alongside work is going to be one of our challenges. And actually science is much worse at doing that than other areas. But at the end of all of this work, we concluded all forecasts for absolutely every one of these activities is upwards, so we need to do something about it. Mentioned 195,000 STEM graduates annually in the UK, but there are lots of shortages, and what employers have told us is that they haven't got they've got square pins for round holes, really, square pegs. Academia is the one that an awful lot of scientists will tell me that that's what they're aiming for. But the jobs are not there, they are elsewhere. But if you go to university professors and ask, where are your students going, the only ones they can remember are the ones that they've either employed themselves or put through a PhD, who have gone elsewhere in academia to work with their friends. They aren't really that aware of who else is employing their graduates. And that obviously is beginning to change, but it's very slow and it's not enough information for the current graduates. So I'm quite vocal at criticising universities for not knowing enough. Looking at why the STEM graduates aren't in STEM employment, well, I think there are two issues here, and I don't yet know whether that's true or false. Part of it is how we define a STEM graduate. Part of it is how we define STEM employment. And part of it is trying to understand why people actually study a science degree in the first place, or a STEM degree. The science community makes an assumption that if you study physics, you want to be a physicist. Now, I studied politics initially, and I had absolutely no intention of being a politician. Quite glad now, because then my contemporaries would have been in a sorry state. But it's odd that, you know, if you study English, you're not expected to go into a particular line of employment. You are opening up opportunities. And yet when we talk about people studying science, we don't think of it as being that huge opportunity to do lots of things that you do when you study humanities. So I don't think that it's true that people are not in STEM employment. Graduates not in graduate jobs. Again, there is a story, particularly in the biosciences, that women are ending up in low-paid jobs for which a degree is not necessary. I think there is some evidence that that's true. This could be something to do with the fact that people are getting a 2-2 in science and employers are not ready to employ people with a 2-2 or a 3rd in science. We don't know the answer to that, and it's a tough one to explore. I think one has to be very careful, but I think it has to be on our agenda. STEM graduates going to the city, well, I hear this all the time. It definitely is not true. If you look at the data, in the broadest possible way of the financial sector, and I took in the analysis, even including working in a post office counter as financial sector, it came up at about 4% of the physics and engineering graduates. It is 25% for maths. That's probably a good thing because we want people to be very numerate. But in other areas like engineering, there are more classic students going into the city than there are in the STEM disciplines. So we should remember that. For us, the financial services sector is a big employer, so graduates will go there. The STEM graduate demand is very strong, and I think one of the reasons for that is what employers call a science mindset. And I think that mindset is about problem solving, it's about analysis, it's about looking for data. One employer said to me, you know, my science graduates are fantastic, they record everything. A lot of people don't. So there are some very good skills. People say that they like science graduates, or at least scientists say that science graduates are in demand because of their ability to work as a team. I'm not sure that employers are really sure about that. I think there is a tendency for communication skills not to be a strength for people who are studying sciences, so that's something we need to work on. The lack of business awareness or awareness of other disciplines from science graduates, so the ability of a science graduate to come into a big team and to understand what the psychologists and the marketing people and everybody are doing and accept those as equals, that seems to be an issue. And I give you an example. Shell, a few years ago I chaired the government's group on science for careers, and we had a guy from Shell working with us, and I think in that year Shell was recruiting 240 graduates globally. Out of that, only about 10% were recruited for their technical or science expertise only. Everybody else was going into a straight graduate program. Now, half of those were STEM graduates, but they were recruited to go into the general program with that science mindset. And then the bigger skills gap is those pre-graduate technical and associate professionals, which really nobody is catering for. In the UK, I think our government expects them all to go off and do 3 science A-levels and go and be a technician. It's just not going to happen, but we don't even have qualifications for them to do at the moment. So now on to the 10 types of scientists. This is a little cartoon we used for some work we did with King's. And this research has identified that young people have a very narrow perception of the scientists. So the ones on the right are the perception of what young people see as a scientist. One's the science teacher, then there's the science technician in the white coat, and the doctor, and that is their trilogy. That is why they're not doing science, because that's actually what they think they're going to do. And there's all of these others on the left-hand side who I think are hugely exciting and fun and younger and more dynamic, who just absolutely not getting a look in because we've geared the young people to look in one direction. One of my ambitions is that a scientist is visible at the bus stop for young people, but I've got some work to do. But then there's another one about who do we have to become in order to fit into the science world, and this is a particular problem, I think, for women who don't clearly see themselves as Einsteins, but there's a perception that you have to be clever, that you probably have to be white, middle class, that you probably have to take a very traditional route of secondary school, doing well in your final exams, going through to a credible university, doing a single subject. And actually there's a lot of your heart that's saying, actually, I don't want to be like that. I ask you whether any of you actually relate to, you look in the mirror and you don't see your professor. That's not, he doesn't define or she doesn't define what you want to be. So we started with footballers. We aimed for 11 scientists. We end up with 10 when we did this work. But as they're not all the same, so the scientists aren't. The science community likes to think of itself as one homogeneous community, but it was quite clear to me when I arrived that they did do different things. And one of the people I went to see was a corrosion scientist. And I said to me, well, just tell me what you do, what type of scientist? And he said, I can't really describe that, but I can tell you that I watch paint dry. And there was another one who talked about what it was to be a geologist. And he said to me, when you climb a hill, you probably think, is there a pub that's open at the top? But I climb it thinking, what's it made of? How long has it been here? How much water is in it? And I think, you know, you are all very different. There was a mathematician who said to me, but I love looking at the mathematical description of the colours in a rainbow. And I'm thinking, yeah, you're very different from me and the other ones that I talked to. So this took a while. We first of all looked at being a scientist and working in other areas. So clearly you can be a scientist working in a clearly STEM environment, like academia or in research, but you can also be working in that environment, managing it, supporting it, raising money for it, for example, in a medical research charity, influencing the future direction, those sorts of things. So that's very close to the science. But you can also see the relevance of your science in another world, like design or policy or teaching and those sorts of things. So then we came up with the 10 types of scientists. I do hope this is going to work. One of my team made this slide. So my first one's the explorer, modelled on Columbus. Then we have the investigator. I think that's the wrong picture. That's the operational service provider scientist who's you know, testing labs, for example. Developer, translating that science into something that's used. We used satellite because it combines engineering and science and facilitates all of the other things that we can do with data and communication. The investigator scientist, this is Sherlock Holmes's investigating lens. Regulator, obviously that's a picture of what we don't want to happen. Entrepreneur, I'm afraid I couldn't find an instantly recognisable British entrepreneur, so I settled for Gates. Communicator, we're all familiar with that. Again, we struggled to find a picture of a female communicator. Teacher scientist, well, we all know about those, very important. Business, very big group. And then finally the policy and campaigning. We all know how bad life can get if your political environment doesn't understand science. So the explorer scientist. So modelled on Columbus, this was the first one we came up with, and the idea came from a conversation with Paul Nurse, because we were talking about how do you manage that scientist who's absolutely going boldly where nobody has gone before, doing it very differently, totally impossible to manage, always wanting your money. But these are the people who win Nobel Prizes and make great breakthroughs. And one of the examples that we have in our 10 types of scientists is Andre Geim, and who discovered graphene. And it's interesting talking to him because what he loves is posing questions. I mean, how many of us looked at scribblings in pencil and said, well, what is that? You see, the rest of us don't ask that question. Your chief scientist here in the UK, in Dublin, he did some work on wound healing, and he just wanted to know, well, why are there no scars on babies? You know, why does that not happen? Some of us just don't ask those questions. So explorers are very good at posing questions that the rest of us don't think about. They're very blue skies, very focused on a very narrow subject usually. Their track record as a scientist and their passion is very visible, but their publication records and outputs might be quite difficult to measure. Investment always has an element of risk. It's often very long term. They face possible failure much more readily than many of the rest of us. They're likely to be employed in a university, very difficult to manage in any other setting, but they do exist. And in the life sciences area, I think you'd put somebody like Crick and Watson into that category. The investigator scientist is the one, if you take the analogy of Columbus, we discovered America, so the investigators went out and mapped it all. Still very blue skies research, an enormous amount of stuff that we don't understand. But they're digging deeper into the unknown, having identified that there is an unknown. They're observing, mapping, understanding, piecing together in-depth knowledge and data, setting out the landscape for others to then translate and to use more widely. They survive in troubled times because their work is, there's so much to find out, but their work is also very broad. Examples, I think, include work on the Human Genome Project. It's partly delving into the detail, but it's also partly enabling others to do other work. Again, mostly located in HE. or a research centre, almost certainly working as a team and a multidisciplinary team. Very attractive. They will weather the storm because of that breadth. The research will be across the spectrum. They'll probably have very good, clear conceptual goals, and they'll have good publication records and a variety of funding streams. They're much more attractive places to work. But like a map, these scientists are undertaking the research that helps the rest of us. So the developer-translator, people often describe themselves to me as an applied scientist, and actually all of the rest of these are, there's 10 types, are applied scientists. So we had to come up with a different name. These people have the skills to sit with one foot in academia and one foot in the environments that are going to develop it. So that might be, for example, they'll have had experience in academia, but they'll be working with the pharmaceutical industry as well, and they'll spot what can be translated and how and what the timescales would be. Many of the scientists who are working on a new compound don't always see immediately what the benefits are, and actually will develop it, like for Viagra, develop it for one thing but end up with it being used for something else because the person in the pharmaceutical industry spotted the potential. Without them, we can't generate income and use from the knowledge that's generated in the universities, but they develop services, ideas. They can also change behaviour. Typically, if you do social science research, making that the outcomes of that research really influence policy is about changing behaviour. So you need one foot in both camps. But setting out that America theme, these are the ones who helped it make money. It's a very special set of skills, and sometimes if you talk to business, they say that academics will come in to make presentations to them, and it's all so detailed and so scientific, making assumptions of the level of knowledge that the business didn't have, that they can't take that gamble to invest. So they're bridging that communication gap as well. These are good communicators, these people. The service provider, these are my hidden scientists, 55,000 of them working in the background of our NHS, definitely an applied scientist, have a depth of knowledge. They're very safe in a laboratory. Some of the others that we've talked about may actually not be doing their own experiments. These ones are very safe. They're not clumsy. They don't have, one described them, I haven't got rugby players' hands. Very careful in the laboratory. They're good with kit. They have the skills to use that knowledge and to transform it to make it something used. All the testing done in the NHS, but they're also doing the testing on air quality, food, a huge growing environment. Every time we apply science and we want to regulate it, somebody has to measure what's actually happening. This is what these people do. Big growth area, but it doesn't necessarily all have to be done at a higher graduate level. DNA testing, forensic science, they all fit into this area. You can imagine the behind-the-scenes work in the Olympics with all the very fast turnaround in testing. So it's the innovation here can come in doing tests faster and more reliably year on year. Monitor regulator, again, a relatively new field. If you didn't regulate science in any way, you wouldn't have to have any of these. Huge shortages, probably a whole range of skills, but at the top level, these people need to be able to speak about the science at a very high level. So they've probably got PhDs, they understand what's going on in the science, but they can also speak to the public and the regulators. So you take something like food standards, human fertilization and embryology, climate change. You need that very high level science to be credible with the science community, but you also need that very high level of science to be credible with the public. They are crucial as we begin to maintain the public trust and confidence in the application of science. I would like to see universities offer modules about science regulation alongside PhD programs, so give young people an option to do that. There's a big mix of skills, so you'll have that science, not so much working in the lab, but understanding the science. But they'll also have the understanding of the policy environment, public concern, they'll be good communicators, they'll be good team players, they'll have a lot of internal persuasion techniques that they'll use to bring people behind them as we regulate science effectively. These people can't make mistakes in the regulation of science, so they do have to have a thorough knowledge that they take their science to. The entrepreneur, well, obviously they play a critical role. They have to have enough scientific knowledge and connections to be able to understand the opportunities, but then they need a foot in the business world to be able to get the money and to make it work. They're going to be very numerate. They blend their science knowledge with the credibility to manage people. They have entrepreneurial flair, very strong understanding in the boardroom. They're credible with banks and the money machine, money lenders. They may need, actually, as they're working their way up, to represent the science thinking at the board level. The very few innovation companies actually have scientists on their board. So if you're the entrepreneur or have been responsible for the innovation, you're going to have to understand how that board's responding to the risk and the balance sheet and carrying the investment. Now, I've got Bill Gates in the middle, who's really unusual as being a scientist who's also a philanthropist, by the way. But the other 10 are the people from our 100 scientists. And on the top, your left-hand side, is Chris Evans, who's the one who's been leading some work on embryo research and stem cell research in the UK. Then we have mathematicians. The third one down there is a young woman from Scotland who's actually innovated in a way to deliver testing. And she's taken that into a private company. Down at the bottom is Dame Stephanie Shirley, who's a computer scientist who actually ran a women-only computing company, but she's also a philanthropist. Haven't been able to find philanthropists in other areas. We need more of these. I mean, the idea that it's exciting to take the science you know into an entrepreneurial environment, we just need to get that over to young people. I think it's a very attractive message. Communicator scientists, very important group. Contrary to what a lot of people in the science world think, I don't think the best communicator is always the best scientist. The idea of putting an explorer scientist in front of the Mayor of London to explain a scientific subject, you know, the chemistry doesn't quite work there. We need to make the communicator, in the science community, we need to trust the communicator, and then the public needs to trust the communicator. Again, I don't think communicators need to necessarily have PhDs in the subject, and if they do, the tendency is that they focus very much on communication in that field. So they need to have a very open mind. In the UK, we have a few master's courses in communication, and that is producing quite a good throughput of people working in journalism and in other areas. I think these people follow a variety of career paths and come to their communication role through a variety of routes. But they need to be able to combine that science and technological know-how with that communication know-how, particularly things like social media. I've seen a lot of science tweets where people reference university websites where I'm 2 lines in and I've stopped understanding it. Twitter is supposed to be about good communication, and you're sending, lots of scientists are sending people to a web page that is unintelligible for most of them. So that follow through, a good communicator wouldn't be doing that. HE is really developing this sector, but they are everywhere. They're in fundraising organisations, they're in government, they're in journalism, it's a whole variety. Science and technology-based businesses have very good communicators. Teacher scientists, probably don't need to go into this too much, but there's a shortage of good STEM teachers. Probably we stopped embracing teacher scientists as part of the science community. And one of the reasons Science Council has chartered science teacher as one of its registers is we want to re-embrace the teachers as fully part of the science community. And then our business marketing, this is the biggest growth area. This is where graduates are going. And I think I am persuaded I understand it fully. And it's because many businesses are very technical, so they need a technical graduate to speak to other technical graduates. Whether you're buying or selling, you need to be speaking the same language. Now, the pharmaceutical industry did recruit a lot of bioscience graduates in their sales workforce, but this is now true in IT. You know, even in places like PC World, graduates are recruited to lead their businesses. In places like Lidl, graduates are recruited to run the logistics. There's a huge pull through on where each of these companies becomes very, very technical. The hospitality industry, you know, you would not think of that as a big STEM employer, but it is. Retailing, huge STEM employer. If you're buying technical devices for somebody like John Lewis or food for Waitrose, it's actually people with, you know, good handling of data skills. They'll know some of the science and where the technology is going, and they're helping making all of those decisions. Good jobs, lots of women doing very well in these. The policymaker, combining science and technical know-how, probably very senior level, may have been previously academics. The ones on the left are, well, we struggled with this. We struggled, actually, when we did our 100 scientists, to find 10 with a science background that we considered to be good policymaker scientists. So 2 of the 4 on the left are actually not scientists. So the top one is Tracy Brown, who's done much to push UK government policymakers to look at evidence. She's a social science graduate, and she runs Science About Science. The one underneath that is, I forget his name, he's the first scientific advisor in a local government at Southampton. Mark Walpert is our chief scientific advisor, who's a clinician. And then Mark Ferguson is the chief scientific advisor here. But one of our other 10 was actually Lord Sainsbury, who had done more for science policy in the UK, and I think he's got a classics degree. Obviously, I wasn't allowed to put myself in that list, but I've got my specialism is tank warfare, so you can still get into being a science policy maker because the balance of skills is different. But these people do need to understand the policymakers. They need to know the Boris Johnson's mindset, and they need to be able to work with it. And our chief scientist described himself as about now 75% scientist and 25% politician. Some of the politicians would say he's only about 10% a politician, and he's got a lot to learn. But that's a different skill set. Now, when you start to look at that explorer scientist skill, you can see how things have changed. Oh, go to next slide. Go on. I've pressed the wrong button here. Got a ThinkPad? If you want some more ideas about what people do in those 10 categories, look at our website. In January, we did the 100 leading UK practicing scientists, and they all got sent a certificate to go on the wall. Some are proud of having it, and some don't like being called an applied scientist. I suspect they put it in a drawer. But the idea here is to give people like you more ideas about the sorts of jobs that people go to. And on a different perspective, I think it's also really important to understand how complex each sector is. Now, the difficulty is when we talk about careers, we tend to talk about working in food. So you probably think immediately food scientist. This is the shape of the food sector in terms of employment areas. Hugely complex. It's a huge issue for all of us at the moment as we're trying to improve food safety, improve production, stop waste, look at air miles, look at cost and all of those things. There are scientists working in every single part of this, but those jobs are incredibly difficult to find. They are very, very rarely going to be called scientist. But everybody has got scientists at very big levels. I think you'll get these. You can have a copy of these slides and you can see those, but it's just a good example of how complex it is. So when you look at the hospitality industry, think about where the technicians and scientists will be working in the hospitality industry rather than thinking I'm going to go and work in a hotel chain. It's very complex businesses. Another piece of work that we've done is to look at the UK science workforce, which we published in 2011. I'm just looking at the data for the next set of the next analysis. And the other people, Brookings Institute, have done a very similar study in the US. We both concluded that about 20% of our workforce was using STEM skills currently, and that the demand for this was increasing. Now, we split the whole UK workforce into core science, related science sectors and non-science sectors, and you can read there what those differences are. I was going through some old boxes that a retired member of the predecessor to the Science Council was giving me because he was downsizing his house. And I had to move them because we've got a new member of staff. And I was going through the files, and I found a 1992 publication looking at mapping the science workforce. And I thought, this is very interesting. And I didn't know it existed until a couple of days ago. And they very helpfully, they found 0.6% of the UK workforce needed STEM skills. And their division of the population was those occupations that were, they called them main science, defined as those that where the practice of science and mathematics is the main activity of those employed. Those where those skills were critical to the effectiveness of what you did. And finally, almost the whole of the rest of the population was put into enhanced occupation, where you could do it better if you had a bit more science. I actually think in 1992, I don't know why more wasn't made of it, but it's very, very sensible approach. So they actually suggested at the time that gardeners, hairdressers, farmers, goldsmiths and chefs could all benefit from a bit more science. I definitely agree with that. So when we write up our new research, we're going to actually refer to that historical data. But we've done something very similar here, trying to look at STEM skills everywhere. And then we divided the workers into primary science workers, secondary science workers and non-science workers. The people who do workforce data like the word workers. The only change we made was that the people who didn't have a graduate were called sub-bachelor, which we've changed to pre-graduate. Anybody who would want to be a sub-graduate, I'm not sure. So the primary science workers are really those main. It's where you're working in something you recognise as a science job. There are about 1.2 million in the workforce. Secondary science workers are where you're science, but you're adding something to it. And I realise we upset a lot of people calling them secondary science. And in the next area, these are going to be called Science Plus, because you've combined your science with something else and make it sound better. And this is what the workforce then looked like. The dark purple are the primary science workers. So they're in every part of the economy. But they vary, the numbers of the proportions vary. So as you would have expected in the pharmaceutical industry, you'd expect to see more core scientists. But it's interesting that in the non-science sectors, on the right-hand side, you've got still 135,000 primary science workers. This sector includes the public sector, so a lot of those are things like the scientific advisors and things in government and local government. These are good jobs. They turned out to be the best paid and mainly male, so that's obviously something we've got to work on. In the secondary science area, in the next strand of data, that small bit of purple has expanded, so that's where the biggest growth is, and we'll be explaining that. But in total, it was 5.2 million, I think, 5.8 million. So 20% of the workforce, 1.2 in primary science. Biggest share in primary science is research and development. Now, let me just give you a bit of a reality check on numbers here. The biggest share in research and development, but in terms of the graduate level, let me give you some numbers. There are 32,000 STEM academics in the UK, 170,000 STEM people doing research, and 5.6 million others. I think you need to look at where employment is, and it is not in academia and research. So although you may have chosen to do a PhD because that's where you thought you might end up, it's actually less likely than you think. Again, you'll get these slides. So the conclusions from this is science workforce more complicated, disparate. Here's my numbers on 32,000 in academia, 130,000 others, 72,000 in education. Obviously that we've had to break down. There were lots of assumptions made about the people with a science background working in teaching. I think that's going to come down to about 40,000. And then all of the others. Expected to be 7.1 million in 2030. I think the figures for last year are about 6.2 million. So the rise is faster than we were predicting. And then there are big regional distribution issues. So in London, if you want to be in England, if you want to be a primary science worker, you're probably going to be in the southeast. That's a negative message for the rest of the country. You're not likely to be living in Lincolnshire, and I want to address that as well. So also bear in mind geography. If you're not that mobile in terms of your ability to move, like a lot of women who have families aren't, then being a primary science worker is difficult. Gender balance, an issue. I'm going to put these all up quickly so we can have some questions. Primary workforce is quite good at 60-40 male-female, but then there are some sectors that are not great. 91% in ICT in the UK male. I think you're much better here in Ireland than that. Higher proportion of females in secondary science, where they do earn more money than if they're in primary science. And one of the things I'm looking at in the next phase is whether the availability of part-time work is a factor. So women tell us that one of the reasons they choose secondary science roles is that they tend to be in environments where diversity is now well established in the ways somebody like Google works. And therefore, being a technical or science-based woman working in Google, you get the same deal and flexible working as you do in any other field. Whereas in academia, there's some evidence that there's less flexible working for the science population. Just some pictures showing the light pink is how well women are having an influence, breaking into these areas. And then you can see manufacturing down there at 96% male. And in fact, on our new data, with the suppression that you have to do on the data these days, the data shows there are no women working in manufacturing at graduate level in London, which can't be true, but it's obviously such a small number, it's been suppressed. And this is the penetration into secondary science, so you can see that women are doing better in these areas. I think we might. And I want to leave you with this because on the left-hand side is all of the students coming into STEM, and this is showing all the ways in which they exit. And if you look down onto the permanent research staff, 3.5% of that huge number that came in ended up doing permanent research in universities or industry, and only 0.45 making it to professorial level. It's a pretty severe narrowing, but that's reality. But I hope I've given you a good feel for where the other opportunities may lie, and a positive picture of where other opportunities might lie.